Thank you for listening to Liberty Christian Center's podcast. Let's join Pastor Paul Carlson for today's message.
All right, I'm free is what we're talking about. And you know, I'm going to read you a story. I'm really blowing all my traditions today. This is out of a book called The Believer's Identification. And this is a story that's reported here. It says this, it says, during the Civil War, there was a man by the name of George Wyatt. There will be no test on this, but just follow me. George Wyatt, he was drawn by lot to go to the front lines. He had a wife and 6 children. Well, there was a young man named Richard Pratt that offered to go in his stead. Now remember that part. Richard Pratt offered to go in his stead. He was accepted and joined the ranks in bearing the name and number of George Wyatt. Well, before long, sadly, Pratt was killed in action. And the authorities later sought again to draft George Wyatt into service, and he protested. And he entered the plea that he had died in the person of Pratt. He insisted, and the authorities consulted their own records as to the fact of his having died in identification with Pratt, his substitute, and Wyatt was thereby exempted beyond the claims of the law of any further service, because he had died in the person of his representative. See, this is the truth of identification. This is not, this isn't even Bible. This is Civil War history. This is the government. They said, hey, we can't call on him again because he died in the person of his representative. Okay? Wow, isn't that something? Where are you going with that, Pastor? Let me read you Galatians 2:20. You see, we're doing this series, we're calling it Free. Free, I like the sound of that. Free, I like the picture. It's a bird let free from a cage. Are you caged up this morning? Has something got you bound? Well, there's good news, and the good news is that Jesus came to set you free. And so in talking about free, we have to go back to why we're free. Why are we free? Are we just free because we say so? Are we free because we confess the word this morning? Confessing the word doesn't, we're not confessing the word to get free. We got free, and therefore we can confess the word. Confessing the word doesn't make you free. Jesus made you free. You confessing it, though, it lays hold on it by faith. You get me? I'm just trying to get the horse before the cart, I guess you'd say. I'm trying to get the proper order here and know this. Jesus is the proper order. In Galatians 2:20, the Apostle Paul said it like this. You'd think he's quoting this story out of the Civil War. He said this, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. See, that's what Paul saw. He said, wow, what Jesus did, it goes far beyond anything we saw in the natural. Jesus was my representative. He went to the cross in my place. Paul said, I'm looking at it right now and I see this, that I was crucified with Christ. So it's no longer me living, but Christ is living in me. Wow. Can I read you this one? The Lawbuck. Now I know you probably don't have that one with you. Frank Lawbuck. His translation says this. It says, Christ took me to the cross with him, and I died there with him. So isn't that amazing? This is not a version, but let me read this. This is just some good words. It says, Christ gave himself for my old self, that his new self might live in me. Christ gave himself for my old self, that his new self could live in me. Wow, it's blowing my mind. Well, your mind needs good blowing, If we're talking about being free, this is where it starts. It starts at the cross. It starts with Jesus. And you know what? Everything we talk about, it goes back to that too. It goes back to Jesus. So in Ephesians 2, in verse 1, I'm just getting us a proper perspective of what free is. In Ephesians 2, verse 1, and Paul, this is kind of a tag. Well, can I say it that way? This is a continuation of the prayer that we were praying in Ephesians chapter 1, that Paul was praying for all the saints. And, you know, he prayed in that prayer that we'd begin to see things from a heavenly perspective, that we'd begin to see things as God sees them, that we'd begin to see that we were raised up with Christ. And I love the way he puts it. He says we're raised up far above all the principalities, powers, and might, and dominion, and every name that could be named. That's us in Christ. And then in chapter 2, it goes on. It says, in you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. He says, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the sons of disobedience. All he's saying here is, guys, all of us were bound up with a bunch of junk in this world. You know, we were whooped by the devil. We were bound up. We were in a cage somewhere. And Jesus came to open up that cage and let you and I out. He says, we all conducted ourselves in the lusts of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as others. You see, the problem with mankind wasn't that they were doing wrong, okay? Now, follow me on this, because sometimes people get tripped up and think I'm saying something I'm not saying. But the problem with mankind, men and women, was not that they were doing bad things. The problem was they had bad things in them. It was a nature problem. It was an inner problem. And Jesus came to set you free. Jesus came to take the old self out and put a new self in. His new self living in me. Wow. So it goes on. It says, but God, who is rich in mercy, because of His great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses and sins, He made us alive together with Christ. By grace, you and I have been saved. Verse 6, and He raised us up together, and He made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Let me tell you, any kind of mental battle you and I get engaged in, any kind of spiritual battle you and I get engaged in, any type of prayer battle you and I engage in, this is the place we pray from. This is the place we operate from. What place is that? We're seated with Christ in heavenly places. Now you can try operating from other places, but this is the place you're going to operate from if you're going to win. Okay? You're seated with Christ in heavenly places. So thoughts come to your mind, telling you what a loser you are, telling you how sick you are, telling you how you're never going to succeed in life. What you do is you rise up on the inside and you say, I am seated with Christ in heavenly places, far above all the power of the devil. And that's the place I'm operating from today. Can I read you one more before we go on to a topic this morning? Colossians 2:15. We're talking about Jesus. We're talking about freedom. We're talking about what belongs to us. We're talking about that the door of the cage is open. You know, why would we want to stay in the cage? I can hardly stay in my house for a whole day. Yes, Dana. I get so antsy just hanging around in one spot. You know, I can't sit in my office for an hour. I have to get up and walk around. Sometimes I just walk down here into the church because I just can't sit there all cooped up. I know. You know that's true, isn't it? It is true. What are you doing? What are you doing? I said, I'm thinking and I'm praying. You know, I'm doing stuff. I get more done when I'm just walking around. I can't even sit and watch TV. I get up and I look nice because I'll go pick up Dana's empty water can. The truth is, I'm antsy. I can't sit in a cage. Colossians 2:15, talking about Jesus, talking about the victory that Jesus won for us in our place. It says, having disarmed principalities and powers, He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. Let me read you a couple different versions. The Coney Bear translation. The Coney Bear, that's the one. All right. It says, stop. He disarmed principalities and powers which fought against him, and he put them to an open shame, leading them captive in the triumph of Christ. This is probably my favorite one, the J.W.C. Wand translation. He says, he stripped away like a cast-off garment every demonic rule and authority and made a public exhibition of them. This is talking about Jesus. This is talking about when that law of the Spirit of life came into Jesus. This is talking about when the same Spirit that raised you and me, well, when it first went into Jesus and it raised him up. You see, all the demonic powers were raged against him, holding him captive. He was in the cage. They said, you're never coming out of this cage. No, 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 no. You're trapped. You're here. You're in my dominion. And the Spirit of God came into Jesus. And I'm telling you what, the door of that cage opened up. He rocketed out of that place. He rocketed out of that place. He left the devil in the dust. He rose up from the dead, picked up his body on the way, said, hey guys, triumph is yours. I did it for you. All right, we're talking about free, and we're talking about why we're free. But now let's talk about some practical applications today. Now, in this series, we're going to talk about a lot of different angles of being free. I'm not going to just camp on one area, but I'm going to start with one today. Numbers 21, verse 4. You see, anything you and I might be bound by, Jesus defeated it and brought us freedom. In Numbers 21, verse 4, in the New Testament, a couple times it says this, that when we read through the Old Covenant and we see things that the children of Israel went through, in the New Testament it says that we're to read the Old Covenant with New Testament eyes. And it says we're to read it and see examples of them, what they went through and how we can live in a good place today because of Jesus, okay? And it's not an exact quote, but it's pretty close. All right. Numbers 21:4, the children of Israel, they're on their way to the promised land, okay? They weren't on their way to a type of heaven because, we find this if we continue to read. When they got to Jericho and all this kind of stuff, they had to defeat giants in the land. They had to tear down enemies. And in heaven, there'll be no enemies like that, okay? But what they were really living out and they were walking out is a type of the life that you and I have today. And so they're on their way to this promised life, this promised land. And it says, and they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And it says this is the only thing I'm going to really get at here in this verse. It says, the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. On the way. Now you can be on your way to possessing what God has for you, and it is possible, just like these people, for you and I to get discouraged. Have you ever been discouraged? I mean, probably nobody here has ever been discouraged. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you're here today and you're a parent and maybe you've been discouraged. Just looking at life. Maybe you've been discouraged. Maybe it isn't the way, that you thought it was going to be. Isn't it funny how when you get to some places in life that it's not always the way you thought it was going to be? Maybe you're even a mom here today, and you've been discouraged. You've been discouraged. Maybe you're a student. Maybe you've just been overburdened with finals. Maybe you're discouraged. I studied everything. Oh my goodness. Maybe you're right here today smack in the middle of the will of God, and you're saying, "Wow, is there something I'm missing? I feel discouraged." Discouragement's a funny thing. Sometimes there's no logic to it. Do you know that? Sometimes there's no real reason to be discouraged, but sometimes it hits you. Sometimes, this is commonly a way that it happens. You're talking with another person, And that person speaks words to you. And sometimes you'll walk away from a conversation and you're still skipping and saying, yeah. Maybe you're not skipping, but you're walking away going, yeah, cool. But then all of a sudden you sit down in your easy chair and bam, words hits you. Words, they just attack you. And they tend to wrap themselves around you. They get into what I'd say they hit your heart, okay? And they try to deflate you. They try to bring you down. They try to cause you to be not the person that God intends you to be. They cause you to be discouraged. That happens to people. Well, let me just give you a nutshell right now. Jesus came to set you free. Jesus came to open the door of that cage, let you fly away. You know, Joyce Myers, I'm thinking about her right now. She said the thing about a pity party. Anybody ever have a pity party? She says the thing about a pity party is they're easy to get into, but they're hard to get out of. And the longer you stay there, the further away that door looks. Tell you what, there's a way out. I'm just, sitting here thinking, as I'm preaching, that's how I do it. Things pop in my head. But I remember John Osteen, not Joel Osteen, but John Osteen. John Osteen was one of my favorites back in the day. He used to come to my Bible school and teach, and Dana and I used to watch him every Sunday night at 11 o'clock. It's one of the few Christian shows we're really a bunch of heathens, Dana, but it was one of the few Christian shows we ever watched routinely. But we used to watch John because he was just a powerhouse. And the thing I would say about John Osteen, he's in heaven now, but he was a very upbeat guy, and just was like a powerhouse. But he actually wrote a book about it once, about a time that he got discouraged. He got so discouraged that this went on for like days, weeks. I might be stretching it to say months, but at least a month. It went on that he was in this deep depression, this discouragement. And when I think about John, that just seems absurd that he would. Can I tell you something? Discouragement and depression doesn't care who you are. It don't care who you are. Anyway, John tells the story of how here he is a preacher. Thousands of people come to his church. He's on TV. Thousands and thousands of people watch him on TV. Dana and I were a couple of those people. And he gets discouraged. He was so discouraged, he said, that he didn't know if he could ever even preach again. So discouraged. That's how real the thoughts were in his mind. That's how real this oppression was that was coming against him. So real, he said, I don't know if I could ever even preach again. Well, he'd had a dream prior to this. And in this dream, he walked into this room. It was a dark room. And it got so dark that he couldn't find any door, any window, any way to escape it. And in this dream, he just stood up. After being in this darkness, he stood up and he said this. He said, in the name of Jesus, I'm coming out of this place. Well, when he was in this deep depression, the Lord reminded him of a dream. God doesn't always, every dream you have is not from heaven. Do I need to say that? I'm a pastor, so I say these things. Because I've seen people do stupid, goofy things with dreams. And even I could do that. But I always go back to the Word. And sometimes you dream things that maybe they're for a future time. Somebody like John, when he first dreamt this dream, he might have sat there and tried to overanalyze it and made something up that wasn't even real. If you dream something from God, here's the thing about it, is that He will let you know exactly what it means when you need to know. Okay? He'll let you know. One thing about a godly dream is it'll not spin you off into a bunch of confusion. Okay? If you dreamt something and you're just, I just don't get it. I don't know then just put that away. Okay? Godly dreams bring life. They bring clarity. So what John said is that he's in the midst of this depression, this absolute discouragement, and the Lord said to him, you remember that dream? He said, you're in the room right now. He says, do what you saw yourself doing in that dream. Well, you'd think when that happens, you'd think that lightning bolts came out of heaven and you'd go, yes, here I am. I command darkness to... Now, you don't feel like that at all. That ain't what you feel like. You feel like you're discouraged. You feel like you're trying to pick yourself up off the floor. But what John did is he stood up in the midst of darkness and he said what he saw himself say in that dream. He said, I command the darkness to go from me now. And when he did that, it was like a hole opened up and he could walk towards the light. No, he could walk out of that place. I tell you this, there's freedom for you and I today. There's freedom for us. Isaiah 53, 4 and 5. It says that Jesus, I'm just going to read this to you, He bore our griefs. He carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed Him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon Him. And by His stripes we're healed. As a preacher, a lot of times have preached by Jesus' stripes we're healed. But the thing is that salvation is so complete. What Jesus did was so far-reaching. He died so you and I could have peace. Peace in our minds. Freedom from oppression. Freedom from discouragement. David said this once. He said in Psalm 40, he said, I waited patiently for the Lord. And He inclined to me and heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and He set my feet upon a rock. And He established my steps. He said, He put a new song in my mouth. Praise to our God. Many will see it and fear and will trust in the Lord. Huh. I'm going to go on here and read you another story. I'm going to just tell you this story. Did anybody ever get discouraged in the Bible? Yeah, there's a lot of people that did. One that comes to my mind right away when I was thinking about discouragement this week was Peter. Isn't Peter isn't he great? Aren't you glad he's in the Bible? Aren't you glad that he is who he was? And he brings me a lot of humor, and he brings me a lot of encouragement, and he brings me a lot of freedom, just to be yourself. God doesn't want you to be some cookie cutter. He isn't up there making Christmas cookies and saying, well, look at this thing, this cutter I got. Let's just make everybody like this. No, He wants you to be you. He wants you to have personality. He wants you to be who you've been created to be. Okay? He's not trying to squeeze you into a mold. If He was, He would have done that to Peter. Okay? But Peter, goodness, you read through, he's the guy that walked on water. He's the guy that jumped out of the boat and he walked with Jesus on the water. He's the guy that went up with Jesus in the Mount of Transfiguration and witnessed Jesus becoming brighter than the noonday sun. He's the one that also said to Jesus, hey, can we build 3 tents and never leave this place? Jesus had to say, Peter, you're totally missing it here. But then there was a time when Jesus was in the garden. And well, here's another one. Jesus is in the garden, and the soldiers came to get Him. Who was it that jumped up to defend Jesus? It was Peter. Whips out his sword and cuts off the ear of a soldier. That'd be the thing to do, right? Thank God for Jesus. Jesus right there, He takes the ear. How wild is that? Would that have been a viral on YouTube or what? Man, I tell you, takes the ear, slaps it back on him, and says, no, we're not doing it this way, Peter. But Peter's the one, too, that Jesus said, before the cock crows 3 times, you're going to deny me 3 times. And of course, we know this. They took Jesus away. And we know this, that Jesus, and Peter was right there watching the whole thing, and 3 times. 3 times. Not once, twice, but 3 times. Peter denied the Lord, denied their relationship, walked away from what was so real. And then when he did that, the cock crowed. How do you say it? Crowed. He let out a noise that reached Peter's ears. And what reached Peter's ears caused great discouragement. Great depression came on the guy. He wept bitterly. This was the voice of a crow, crowing. But then it reached his ears and he went, ah! He was like, man, I can't go on. Now, as we read about Jesus being crucified, the only disciple that's recorded to be there when Jesus died on the cross was John. So I would just guess that Peter couldn't face it. In fact, it wasn't until Jesus rose up from the dead. 3 times Jesus appeared to Peter and the disciples. But it's when Jesus gave Peter a mission, he said, now go forth, take care of my sheep. Go forth, feed them. That we find Peter on the day of Pentecost standing up in the crowd of 3,000 people, being who God called him to be. We heard a guy teach last fall, Dana and I did. We were at our Rhema Ministerial Association retreat, and we heard a guy talk about people coming out of depression. And, I'm not going to give you a whole teaching on it, but one thing he said is that one of the best things you can do is go help other people.
That's good.
I think that's what Peter did. He got a word from heaven and he went out and he gave it away. And it caused him to rise up and be the Peter we read about in the book of Acts. John the Baptist got discouraged. Now, John the Baptist, was a cousin of Jesus, goodness, he knew Jesus in a real way. He actually baptized Jesus and heard a voice come from heaven, saying, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. He heard the voice thunder out of heaven. Would that just change you forever? Wouldn't that just be like, wow, I'd look back at that my whole life and say, I heard God speak when I was baptizing Jesus. Just let alone you're baptizing Jesus. But then you hear God speak. You'd never come down from that, right? Well, then, let's see, where are we here? Luke 7, we find this. Well, here we find John. He's in jail. He's in jail. He's in prison. And it's not going to be a good outcome here. But here he is in prison, and what he does in Luke 7:19 is he sends his disciples out to find Jesus and say this. He says, are you the one coming, or do we need to look for another? This is what discouragement will do, is it'll cause you to doubt the very foundational things you believe in. Sometimes, you read that and you think, well, he's just confirming everything. Come on. He baptized Jesus and God spoke from heaven. And here he is in this prison and he's doubting the things that were so real to him. He says, can you go find Jesus and ask him, are you really the one? Discouragement will do that.
Thank you for listening to Liberty Christian Center's podcast. To partner with this ministry or for any additional information, please visit libertychristiancenter.org.